It's time now for our news review segment where we take a look at one of our stories in a bit more detail. Germany has displaced hundreds of Afghan refugees to make room for the Ukrainians fleeing the conflict back home. The government says there was no alternative since Ukrainians, quote, needed a roof over their heads. The Afghan refugees say social workers came with eviction notices, giving them 24 hours to clear out their houses. The Berlin Refugee Council has expressed concern over the government's biased treatment of refugees in the past few months. Social workers have also voiced frustration over the treatment of Afghans as well as other West Asian and North African refugees in Germany. In 2021, some 12,000 Afghans arrived in Germany after the Taliban's takeover. Joining us for this edition of the News Review is Daniel Lazar, author and journalist from New York, and also Rodney Shakespeare, author and political commentator from London. Professor Shakespeare, allow me to start with you. What's the difference between a Ukrainian refugee fleeing violence and an Afghan asylum seeker also fleeing violence?
Probably it's the colour of their skin. The Western globalists are evil. The war in Ukraine, from which the refugees are coming, could be stopped now by a straight declaration that Ukraine will remain neutral, there'll be no movement of NATO to the east, and by saying there'll be implementation of the Minsk Accords. They're not doing that because they're in the game of trying to destroy Russia, promote Russia, ultimately because they want to get at China. And then when you get these refugees coming in, you're getting a straight race. The Afghan refugees are heavily traumatized and they're insecure, and they're now being put into another traumatic situation. And then on top of this, the Western globalists are then going to inflict upon the European populations what are going to be astonishing price rises in gas, energy, and in food prices and other things. You're looking at sort of weird, evil, manifesting itself in all sorts of ways.
Professor, thank you. Daniel, welcome. Daniel, what do you make of this two-faced policy by Germany towards asylum seekers?
I agree with absolutely everything Professor Shakespeare said. I would only add that the Afghan refugees represent an American defeat, and therefore Germany holds the Afghans responsible, Germany being a dutiful servant of the American imperial masters, and that the NATO is still hoping to win the war in the Ukraine, and so therefore it regards the Ukrainian refugees as somehow more deserving of reward. That's the only difference. But and I would also second Professor Shakespeare in saying that this NATO war is imposing huge costs on Europe, including Germany, in the form of refugees. Refugees are not cheap; they require a lot of money to take care of, and it's a cost that the United States is very happily shunting off onto Germany. So it's outrageous, all around.
Right, Professor Shakespeare, if I get back to you, this policy we're seeing is not just limited to Germany. If we look at Europe as a whole, we take the United Kingdom, for example, which has opened its hearts, not just its homes, to Ukrainian refugees. And that's great, that's something humanitarian. But on the other hand, it's now sending non-Ukrainian refugees all the way to Rwanda. What do you make of this discrimination?
Well, it is discrimination. And Daniel was raising the much bigger issues. And part of the bigger issues, of course, respect of the refugees coming into the United Kingdom is that it is Western failure to nurture, to encourage and develop fair, just economies in areas of the world that lead to all these economic refugees. And I'm sure Daniel would point out that the refugees come from places like Libya, which we smashed up, Syria, which we smashed up, Iraq, which we smashed up, and all the colonies whose assets we rip off. I mean, all these are ultimately manifestations of the corruption in various ways of the West. It's extraordinary. It all seems to be coming together.
So, Daniel, this one's for you. When we see this kind of racism, does it serve other purposes for the German or the UK or the French government, or is it just purely an imperialistic, racist approach?
Well, it's all those things. I mean, racism is a big part of the story. I mean, to me, what I find the most shocking aspect of the NATO war effort in the Ukraine, and NATO, of course, is waging this war, even though it's via its Ukrainian proxies. But to me, the most shocking aspect is the determination to cover up the role of the neo-Nazi element in the Ukrainian armed forces, which is huge. And it's not Russian propaganda, it's a fact. And the Western media, the Western governments is covering this up, covering up the presence of this racist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic element, which is playing a major role in the fighting. So that is certainly reflective of the reactionary impulse behind the NATO war effort.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and your time. Let me thank our guests for their contribution. Daniel Lazar is an author and journalist joining us from New York, and Rodney Shakespeare, author and political commentator, joining us live also from the British capital, London. That brings an end to another edition of...
If you see something, say something.